And we're at the temple, in and around the temple, for everything we're going to talk about today. The tone varies. You're going to see the full range of Jesus' emotion. In fact, I'm going to argue that there's one chapter in which we see more of a range of emotion in Jesus than just about anywhere else in Scripture. All right. And the purpose? To expose the Second Temple Judaism and what it had become, to expose what its leaders had become, what they were modeling for God's people, and to equip his disciples for a mission I don't think they had a clue. I know I wouldn't have had a clue of what it was going to be like, because he was going away and his church was going to be theirs. You know, if you think about a teacher, and I've taught college for a long time. Day job, I'm a math professor at York University, and the last couple days of class, what should a teacher be doing anyway? Should be connecting dots. Why were you here for 15 weeks? Why did you do all this? Why did we go through all this? You should be putting together the big picture, the foundational beams and planks upon which this knowledge and this subject area is built. Repudiating fundamental errors and misconceptions in the field that hopefully during the semester you've addressed. You make clear, because there's a final exam coming up, right? You make clear what students are responsible for having learned and for having done. Because a time of reckoning, the final exam, is near. The few days that we have here in the beginning, now we're going to start right after the triumphal entry, and we're going to end right before Jesus' arrest. That's several days, but there's a lot that goes on there. There's some scrapping that goes on there. And it marks the end of Jesus' public ministry. Now, if you think about that, all the Gospels and everything, his public ministry is coming to a close in these very days. A time of reckoning is near, the cross is near, and he more than once emphasizes that, yes, judgment is near. Assessment, as we call it in the education business, is near. Almost all of Jesus' teaching during the temple, during Passion Week, occurs in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Almost none of it's in John. We have private teaching with his disciples in John, and a lot of it. At the Last Supper, you got chapters of it, okay? But his public ministry is really outlined in the Synoptic Gospels. And so we have his first act. He comes to Jerusalem. I don't know if the night he gets there of the triumphal entry, he actually goes to the temple and looks around and then goes home. He's staying in Bethany. Bethany is about 1.5 miles away. It's across the Kidron Valley on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And he goes away. And I would like to have been a fly on the wall of his conscience about what he saw inside. Because the next morning, this is what happens. Oh, by the way, you're going to see the finest graphics that AI has to offer. I promise you, for better or worse, the sermon's mine, right? I do not like AI-generated Bible lessons. I just don't. I think they're shallower than a sheet of paper for the most part. Maybe I'm not paying enough. Maybe I'm not paying the premium stuff and they get more. Maybe I should, But So I asked AI and they did pretty good here. They got the whip out of cords, and they got doves flying places and animals and the tables overturned. And so he goes in. His entrance was kingly. And this would be the second time he cleansed the temple. The first time is in the beginning of John, the very beginning of his public ministry. So they're almost like bookends. Now, In John chapter 2, that occurs. And some scholars believe that, there's a few out there who believe that it was the same time, that the Jewish temple guards would not have let him clear the temple a second time. But everything else around that is, in John, is at the beginning of his ministry. He just did water into wine in Cana. And so I believe that was the beginning of his ministry. And this is near the end. And by the way, one inaccuracy here is that in the account we have here, there's no mention of a whip out of cords. He cleared it barehanded, right? Okay. And now, so after 2 years, he's back. And you got to think the temple guards, there were temple guards. You got to think like, well, that guy, watch this guy in the temple area and everything. Well, here he goes again, right? And he was outraged for probably for several reasons, but I think there were two main reasons that are mentioned. And we're not going to be reading tons of text. I'm going to be hitting things, and I think a lot of these will be familiar with most of you. But there were two main things that actually mentions. He says, my house is going to be a house of prayer. And that's a quote out of Isaiah chapter 56. And Mark adds a little extra phrase. If there's an extra phrase in any of the gospel accounts, it's usually in Mark. Mark has fewer accounts. It's the shortest gospel. But if it has an account, it's probably the longest version of it, for the most part. And he says, my house will be a house of prayer for all the nations. They didn't like that at all. The Pharisees and stuff, they were us and them club. And they had set this up in the court of the Gentiles, where the Gentiles were invited in, the nations were invited in to pray to Yahweh of hosts. And they were setting up their marketplace. And then it says, you've made this a den of robbers. Probably overcharging tourists who had to come to Jerusalem. There was one of the required feasts. They had to come. They needed animals to sacrifice, and it specifically mentions the doves. The doves. Now, the doves were for poor people. Once again, blocking out the marginalized that Jesus wanted in his house, right? It really is amazing. It says the priests and the scribes, they saw these things, and they heard the children shouting, Hosanna. And that just got under their skin. That was exactly the same thing the crowds were shouting the day before in the triumphal entry. The children are shouting it in the temple. Okay. So he goes back out. There's an incident of the fig tree. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Matthew compresses things. What does that mean? He takes, like we would, you took a trip to California. What did you do out there? Well, we saw some national parks, went to the beach, saw some friends. Well, does that mean you saw all the friends at one time? Or did you see a friend one time and see a friend a week later or something? Did you go to the beach all the same day? And that's what Matthew does here, because the Mark account has Jesus cursing the fig tree on the way in to Jerusalem and seeing it on the way out that it had withered. Okay, this has got nothing to do with figs. Mark even says it wasn't even the season for figs. It's got nothing to do with figs. There's going to be some themes we're going to come back over and over and over again. And these are the drum beats I want to focus on instead of going through all the text. And one drum beat is fruitfulness. And that fig tree, often trees were a symbol in the Old Testament for what? Israel. Okay. And yours is barren. And he cursed it, and on command, later on that next day, it was gone. The disciples are amazed. And it's interesting that he says at the very end, if you believe, you'll see whatever you ask for in prayer. You're going to do amazing things in prayer if you just have the faith. What you just saw there, you ain't seen nothing yet. You haven't seen nothing yet. And then later, next, he has his authority challenged. It's interesting. This is in chapter 21, verse 23. It says, by what authority do you do these things? They weren't even saying he was doing the wrong things. Well, they probably didn't agree with a lot of it, but that wasn't their hobby horse. By what authority are you doing them? Now, of course, as rabbis often did, as teachers often do, you answer a question with a question. Okay, and he says, okay, John's baptism, was it from heaven or was it from men? And they go, oh, they get over here on the side and they say, we don't know, because they saw that they were checkmated either way. And he says, well, neither am I going to tell you. Neither am I going to tell you from what, where my authority comes from. Now, they knew the correct answer. They knew John's baptism was from heaven. But they also knew what that meant. And ironically, that's the answer to the first question. By what authority are you doing these things? The authority was from heaven. Oh, this stuff is just too good. There are so many connections here. Next up, though, we have a couple of parables. And we have two vineyard parables. Vineyard in the Old Testament, regularly a metaphor for Israel. And we have two parables. They're often called in commentaries and so forth worker parables. They're vineyard parables, because both of them deal with workers in a vineyard. And it was the vineyard, I believe, was more of Jesus' point here. Jesus is going back and forth to Jerusalem here for pretty much all of Passion Week. He's going back, when I say back and forth, from Bethany to Jerusalem, right? And it's interesting, at the end of today's text, we're going to chapter 25. Chapter 26, verse 1, opens with, when Jesus had finished saying all this. In other words, it puts a bow tie on a body of teaching of Jesus here. And Matthew has 5 large bodies of Jesus' teaching. You don't find those in Mark. You find them in John, but you don't find them in Mark. You find some in Luke. He has 5 big bodies of teaching. The most famous one is the Sermon on the Mount. But there's other ones, and this is a huge body of teaching, 5 chapters. But these parables, the first one is about workers. He basically sends 2. One says won't go, later goes. One says he will go and doesn't. Which one? Which one has done the will of the Father? Well, they took the bait. He says, well, I suppose the one that went and did the work. Where's he going to go with this? The next parable is the parable of the tenants. The parable of the tenants says, the master, God, entrusted a vineyard, built this fancy vineyard, entrusted it to servants who were supposed to produce its fruit. He sends people back to produce his fruit. They beat one group, they beat the other group. Finally, he sends his son, they kill him. Right? Okay. When the owners of the vineyard comes, what will he do, they ask. This is down in verse 40. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard returns, what will he do to these tenants? Right? He says, he will bring the wretched to a wretched end, they replied. And he'll rent out the vineyards to other tenants who will give him his share of the fruit at harvest time. They took the bait again, because he's about to turn that right around, saying, y'all haven't produced the fruit. I should mention up in the first parable with the 2 sons, he ends that by saying, up in verse 31, he says, which of these 2 did the will of the Father? They said the first. Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in a righteous way, and you did not believe him. But tax collectors and prostitutes did. Once again, another key theme here is all nations. the slimy tax collectors and prostitutes who you look down on and sneer because they're sinning, right? Along with most of the Jewish population, by the way, of Israel, was when it talks about sinners, especially in the Gospel of Luke in particular, when he says, tax collectors and sinners, it's not people going out sinning up a storm, although everyone's sinning. It's people who couldn't keep the minutiae of the law. They couldn't, it was an agrarian culture. And if you deal with animals, you're going to have animal stuff. It's going to make you unclean a lot of the time. You're going to have dead animals. It's going to make you unclean a lot of the time. You're going to be spreading what animals produce, maybe on crops. It's going to make you unclean a lot of the time. And they were on the outside. There was the innies and outies with the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We're going to see some other groups here too. So here at the end of the parable of the wicked tenants, in verse 43, therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you, because you rejected the stone that the builders rejected, which you rejected, has become the capstone. It's going to be taken away from you, and it's going to be given to a people who will produce its fruit. The barren fig tree, it ain't about figs. It's about fruitfulness. It was about the condition of Israel and the condition of the temple. And so is this. We have next in the beginning of chapter 22, we have a parable of a banquet. We can't go into this in great detail, but very important. The master prepares a great banquet. He invites the important people. They don't come. They're not responding to the master. And he goes out in the country lanes and so forth, and he invites everyone they could find, it says. Invites everyone they could find. And it says in verse 8 of chapter 22, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited are not worthy. Therefore, go to the crossroads and invite to my banquet as many as you can find. So the servants went out on the streets and gathered everyone they could find, both good and evil. And the wedding hall was filled, all the nations. Right? Go out and invite those sinful people. Those people who dirty your seats, right? Those people who you don't want to be around, the Pharisees and religious leaders. Okay? And so those who were not initially invited were able to attend because they all were clothed. They were clothed in the vestments of the Son, whom they were there to celebrate. And then there's one guy that doesn't have those. He's thrown out, right? Okay. Now, this slide. Trapping Jesus. Okay. Many are called, but few are chosen. Verse 14, verse 15 of chapter 22. Then the Pharisees went out and conspired to trap Jesus in his word, and they bring 3 great traps. I mean, these are sweetheart traps. And they're going, surely we're going to get him on one of these. And they're increasingly nuanced gotcha questions. And they're presented by 3 different Jewish groups. One by one, Jesus masterly shoots down their traps. And thanks to AI, we happen to have a picture of that. So I say, look at the disciples, man. They're but you know what? We think Jesus was more safety oriented. May have been like this. He's got the ear pro on and the goggles, right? And look at the disciples. 10 perfect. Right? I know. I'm not sure. There might be a textual variant or something that's got that in it, but no. First one is paying taxes to Caesar. And we've mentioned before, I know I've mentioned in my lessons before here, that the Jews were afforded a good deal of autonomy by the Romans, as long as they did 2 things: kept the peace and paid the taxes. Should we be paying taxes to Caesar? Right? Now, keep in mind, they're looking for a way, it says, at the last part of chapter 21, it says they wanted to arrest him but were afraid of the crowds. They needed a pretext to arrest Jesus. And what trapping him in his words, they were hoping would give him that. Okay. So in this first one, two unusual, some odd bedfellows get together. It says, the Pharisees sent their disciples. So the Pharisees don't come, but they send their disciples. Okay? Pharisees of all generations always have disciples, or at least they want them. Okay? And then it says, along with the Herodians. Who were the Herodians? Well, the Herodians were a group of Jews who supported the Herodian family politics, the Herodian family regime. Okay? Early on, the Herodians really liked a group called the Essenes. They really liked a group called the Essenes. And some scholars think that the Herodians really are the Essenes in the Gospels because the Essenes were a major Jewish group. They're the ones from whom we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, on the cliffs of Qumran. Okay? We can thank them for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They fled Jerusalem. They thought the Pharisees were too liberal. Okay, we're talking strict people. But anyway, but oddly, they're not mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. So there's some scholars that think they might be in the Herodians there. Okay, but my personal conviction is they were by the Dead Sea by this time. They were not in Jerusalem. They had fled Jerusalem. Anyway, my point is, he's got two odd bedfellows because the Pharisees did not like the ruling Herod family at all. Okay, but the disciples of the Pharisees come. Is it good to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Their insincerity is so thick you can cut it with a knife, right? Verse 16, Teacher, we know that you are honest and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You seek favor of no one because you pay no attention to external appearances. Well, yeah, okay. So tell us what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? It says Jesus knew their evil intent, right? You can't massage the Messiah, right? You can't do that. And so, so what does he do? He says, bring me a denarius. And here is a non-AI picture. That is a denarius. And that's Caesar Tiberius on his image there. And he asks them, whose image and whose inscription is on this? And they said, Caesar's. Okay. Now, the problem was that inscription, okay? The image, yeah, but the inscription especially. Because the inscription, there it is in Latin at the top, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. He was the first official Caesar. Julius Caesar was like the George Washington of the Roman Empire, right? But the first one that bore the official title Caesar was Augustus, okay? And son of the divine Augustus? That sounds a lot like son of God, right? You couldn't have these coins in the temple area. That's why there were money changers. Because you had to get the temple coins and temple currencies. Okay, so that was the problem. And then, of course, his famous line: "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So, in light of that inscription that claims divinity, Jesus is basically saying, there's really nothing that belongs to Caesar. They knew. And his claim to divinity belongs only to God, and the Son of God title belongs only to him. Next group, please. Marriage in the afterlife. Now, this is a nice scene. I might like to have been there, right? I like this. So the next one is marriage at the resurrection. And this time it's the Sadducees. Okay, and the Sadducees, they were a political party. They were much more powerful, but they had less broad public support, right? They believed only in the Torah, the Pentateuch. They didn't accept the rest of the Old Testament. Can you believe it? Right. They kind of went away when the temple was destroyed in AD 70 because that was their deal. They ran the temple and they ran the Sanhedrin. Okay, but they didn't believe in the rest of the Old Testament besides the Torah. They didn't believe angels or the afterlife. And so that's the nature of their little trap. This is trap number 2, right? And it refers to something called the levirate marriage. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And to us today, this is gross. But a younger brother, if his older brother died without having children, was married, the younger brother was obliged to marry or to have children with the widow. And this preserved his family line, it preserved his inheritance, his property, and so forth, okay? This was a command. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And so they said, well, if you believe this afterlife stuff, guy has 7 brothers, they all marry the same woman, and in the afterlife, whose wife will she be? She finally dies, right? And he says, well, no. He tells some of the most learned people on the planet in terms of Torah. And ironically, he appeals to concepts outside the Torah. He gives a Pharisaic type answer to the Sadducees, because he appeals to the afterlife, which they don't believe in. Okay, he says you're ignorant of the scriptures and the power of God. And then he goes on and explains there's not going to be marriage, you're not going to be giving in marriage. And these paragons of politics did not know the scriptures, and they did not know the power of God, which is, the two are inextricably linked. This is the power of God, right? This is the power of God. So when the resurrection occurs, no one will be married, no need to procreate. I had somebody stimulate my thinking the other day and said, will there even be male and female in heaven? If there's not the need to procreate and have marriage, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to go there. But basically, Jesus closed their case in one breath. Boom, mic drop, right? The Sadducees were likely offended, but it says in verse 23, the crowds, that's the third group here. You got the Jewish leaders, you got the disciples, and you got the crowds. Those are the 3 groups during Jesus' last days at the temple. The close of his public ministry, and it's interesting to see his tone and his thrust of his message to each of those 3 groups. It says they were astonished. And then the big one came. 2 down, 1 to go. The greatest commandment. 613 precepts of the law that Jews had, and they still use that number today. They still use that number today. Ben Shapiro uses that number all the time. And they were always arguing, what is the core group from which all the other commands could be derived? What's the core? And they were arguing, well, you could do away with this one. This one's implied by these other 2, so you can really leave that one out, and it would be included. And they were trying to narrow it down, right? He's being asked the most actively debated question in the rabbinic world at the time. This was it. So the traps get harder and harder, extremely nuanced. With 613 commands, you can imagine how complicated deciding which one is implied by the other can get, right? And ironically here, to the Pharisees, this time the Pharisees are showing up in person. They sent their disciples before, right? He quotes the part of the Old Testament that the Sadducees accept. He quotes the Torah. And he quotes the Shema. Right? That's the central creed, the most sacred prayer. Our Lord is one. Therefore, love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your mind, Mark adds, and your strength. And then the second one, I'll give you a freebie. Buy one, get one. BOGO, right? Love your neighbor as yourself is the second. There's no record that the Pharisees responded. That is amazing. There's no record that they responded. It says, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. You want an answer? I just gave you one. You want an answer? I just gave you one. Then they mention here, there's a little part about whose son is the Christ. I'm going to skip that. We go on to chapter 23. You have the 7 woes, and you could spend a long time here. But this is what I would argue this chapter 23 in general, you see Jesus' whole span of emotions. And he's talking, of course, the woes are to the Pharisees and teachers of the law, right? Scribes and Pharisees. Okay? But he also, there's even a little spot where he even addresses his own followers. He says something that's remarkable. He says, in chapter 23, verse 3, so practice and observe everything they tell you. They sit in Moses' seat, which was the main chair in the synagogue, and they dispense the law. They dispense what Moses wrote and was revealed. So practice and observe everything they tell you. That I still can't wrap my head around that one. He's telling them to do the heavy. He says they tie heavy burdens on people. He's saying do them. That's what it says. But he also says, here's your problem group. Y'all don't do them. Right? You're putting the burdens on them and not on themselves. Now, if they really were carrying the burdens themselves, you think they would demand them of other people? They would see that they're unbearable. And even Peter in Acts chapter 15, there's the whole debate in Jerusalem over whether Gentile converts had to keep the law. And he says, why should we put on them a burden that we were never able to keep? This is in Acts chapter 15. They knew the answer. They knew the answer. But you're still doing it to those under you. And how you treat those who are under you, quote, under you at work, under you in, quote, authority, whether it's parents to children, boss to an employee, and so on, that really says a lot about you. And he's ripping them wide open. But he's got this little section, he actually directs it seems at his disciples. In verse 8, he says, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher. Right? And do not call anyone on earth your father, for you have one Father. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever wants to exalt himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Then he starts in on his woes. That's before any of the woes. Then it's whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. He skins them alive here. We don't have time to go into this, but it's worth noting. It's worth noting that at the end of all this, with all his heated anger, he says here at the very end in verse 36, I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation. What generation? Well, back up in verse 30. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, just talking about how they treated the prophets, if you had lived in the days of our fathers, we would have acted better. We would have acted better. We would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your fathers. You snakes, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? And then after all that, he talks about the judgment that's going to come. And all this is going to come, it says in the last verse 36, on this generation. Now, who do you think this generation is? The people he was speaking to, the generation that was alive at the time. Okay? And there are other forms of eschatology. This comes into chapter 24. But after all that, what does he do? He laments over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to her. How often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing. We see the full breadth of the character of Jesus Christ in chapter 23. The full character. And there are, I'm thinking of the Garden of Gethsemane. That's probably another place where you see the full, but this is a place where we really can see our Lord stand out in this. Look, your house is left to you desolate. Oh, there's people in it. It's desolate. For I tell you that you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Chapter 24. Now, chapter 24 is a doozy. I am not even going to touch. It's two big parts. They're walking away, and the disciples are kind of making chit-chat. Look at how pretty the buildings are, right? And they were massive. These Herodian stones that are on the outside of the temples, they're walking on their way to the Mount of Olives, which is like a half mile away. And they're walking away, and they're seeing these Herodian stones that some weigh 20, 30, 40 tons, right? And he leaves. They're leaving a heated conflict. And, Jesus wasn't having small talk that night, right? He says, you see all these stones? You see all these things? Right? Not one stone's going to be left on another. And to this day, there's debris of the temple at the basis of those walls, some of it left. To this day, outside of Herod's wall. And it's bearing like silent witness to the accuracy of Jesus' predictions. All these millennia, it's there. Tick, 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 tick. So they make their way across the Kidron Valley, up to the Mount of Olives. And this is Jesus' most lengthy discourse on the end times. And it's got two main sections. One, they ask him two questions as they're leaving. When he says one stone won't be laid on another, when will this happen? That's question number one, which Jesus answers in verses 4 through 28 of chapter 24. We can't go there today. By the way, I love this passage. We have a small group that meets at our house in York, a part of the East Hill Ministry. That we looked in this passage for over a year, every Sunday night. And then it's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, verses 4 through 28. And then there's the second question: what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And that one he answers in verses 29 through 44. And there are near-term interpretations of that, and there are long-term interpretations of that. Because there's a word that's used there on coming. It's called parousia. Okay? And it can mean coming in judgment as well as coming in person. All right? And he came in judgment at AD 70, and of course he's coming back again. Right? So when we say Jesus' second coming, well, let's just say his last coming. Okay? Because he came in judgment certainly in AD 70. So given all of the above, the best you can do, what does it say? It says in verse 36, therefore I tell you all these things will come upon this generation. He used that at the end of chapter 23. It's the same day, folks. It was that generation. Some people, oh no, it's the generation that was alive at the time he comes back. No. He's talking to some of the same people, his disciples. Right. Anyway, we can't really go there. But one of the things he goes ahead and says at the end of chapter 24 is that you got to be ready. The best you can do is keep watch, because the kingdom's going to come. It's going to come like a thief. Thieves don't announce themselves, right? In verse 44. So here he's talking to who? He's talking to his disciples here. His public ministry ends at the end of the 7 woes. That's the end. That's the last time he speaks to the big crowds. From now on, it's small, and to the authorities. And then after he's resurrected, who is it? It's his disciples mainly, right? After that. Okay. We have another one, parable of the 10 virgins. What's the upshot there? The 10 virgins? Preparedness. Bring your oil. Stay vigilant. Preparedness. A thief in the night, preparedness. Be vigilant. Be ready. And he's saying that to who? The other guys? He's saying it to his disciples. Who are we today? We're his disciples. Be vigilant. Live prepared. Live ready. Have oil in our lamps. Then there's the parable of the talents. Oh my. Oh my. It is... He says, I'm not going to be bodily present with you. But like the talents, he gave 5 to 1, 2 and 1. Right? 5 and 2 and 1. And it says, the man who received 5, he says he put it to work and earned 5 more. And you know the story. Oh, welcome in. Well done, my good and faithful servant. The one with 2 gets Same commendation. The one with one, he's like, oh, I was scared. You're a scary man. He goes, no, you're wicked and you're lazy. He calls him wicked and lazy in verse 26. You should have deposited my money with the bankers. I would at least gotten interest. Well, that's fruitfulness. He expected fruitful labor with what he had given them. He expects fruitful labor with what he's given us. Now think of Omaha. Think of campuses. Think of your family. Think of your neighbors. Think of those who have interaction with you. He's expecting fruitful labor from us in that vineyard. And he's expecting us to be alert and aware of what's going on around us at a level those who are blind and dead in spirit cannot be. Cannot be. We got the parable of the sheep and the goats. Right? Giving a glass of cold water, right? Well, who did we ever do? Well, whoever you give a glass of cold water in my name, you did it for me. You did it for me. Oh, let's go have the organization give a glass of cold. No, he says you give a glass of cold water. We're the ones who are supposed to be giving the glass of cold water to our neighbors. And in so doing, giving it to our master. And our neighbors are who? They're the ones we're trying to bring in. It's the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders who drew the lines on the walls. They didn't want them in. This is kingdom theology flipped totally on its head in these chapters. It's preparedness. The Olivet Discourse we just did. This is sort of a little chart. You have the three groups down the left-hand side. Jewish leaders, apostles, and disciples, and then to all people. The thrust, authority, and their hypocrisy. At the beginning of his ministry, he did his miracles to establish authority. Remember the northern miracles? I preached on a couple months ago here, right? The northern miracles were largely to establish his authority on a widespread basis. It still never reached these knuckleheads. Has it reached us? Are we in the knucklehead category? Are we in the vigilant disciple, vigilant, prepared about the master's work when he comes? Those are the two categories, right? And then there's the crowds, right? He was trying to convince the Pharisees, I'm here. You've been unfaithful in the vineyard. You need to repent. He tells the apostles and disciples, go out and do the master's work. Be vigilant in the vineyard. And he tells the people, know who I am, in so many words. I'm oversimplifying here, obviously. So it's confrontational with religious. He was hard on people who were hard on people. You've heard that mantra before. It was assurance. It was assurance. He tells them in the Olivet Discourse, you're going to see all these things happening around you. You're going to freak out. No. Those things have to happen. That's all part of the status quo. You just be about the work. You just be about the work. And time is short. There is urgency, right? So Jesus to his disciples, that is Jesus to us. What he urged his disciples to do and keep doing and be about doing, he wants us to do and keep doing and be about doing. Right? Keep watch, be ready. So the destruction of Jerusalem, be ready. Be ready. And sure enough, right before Titus came in and leveled the place, right? The Christians were allowed to escape Jerusalem. That is documented. Josephus makes it clearer than day. It was the Jews that didn't want to give up the temple that wound up getting destroyed. The second coming, whether it's near term or far term, same message. Be ready, be prepared. 10 virgins, be prepared. Have oil in your lamps, be about the master's work. The parable of the talents, sheep and goats, both of them are saying he expects fruitful labor, just like he did out of the Jewish leaders, and they had not done. He expects fruitful labor out of his church. He expects fruitful labor out of our families. He expects fruitful labor out of our daily relationship with God. Who they rejected, we must welcome. It was us and them. Now, for sure, we need to be able to recognize us and them. That's not a snooty way. That's not you got to have some, clear in your head who's saved and who's lost. There's a gospel to be obeyed. Okay? And when we think most of the world's okay, were we? Were we when we were called? No, we weren't. And we're just a beggar showing another beggar where his bread. But the people they rejected, who they didn't want in their midst, we welcome in our midst. What they quit doing, we must keep doing. And that was working. That was producing God's fruit. God expects, the Master expected, fruitfulness that the religious leaders had not delivered. We must keep doing. Who they were no longer, God's faithful people. We must always be faithfully about the Master's work. Amen.